the forbidden faith of the Cathars Montségur, the Crusade and the Holy Grail myth. Hello and welcome back to Driftwood Histories. Tonight, our journey takes us to the sun-drenched, windswept landscapes of southern France, to the region known as the Languedoc. Here, in the 12th and 13th centuries, amidst the castles of powerful counts and the songs of the troubadours, a different kind of Christianity flourished. It was a faith of stark simplicity and profound dualism, a faith that rejected the worldly power of the Roman Catholic Church and sought a direct, personal connection to the world of the Spirit. They called themselves simply the good Christians, or the good men and good women. But their enemies, the Church of Rome, gave them another name, the Cathars, from the Greek word katharos, meaning the pure ones. And the Church did not see their purity as holy. It saw it as the most dangerous heresy to threaten Christendom in 1,000 years. This is the story of the Cathars, the heretics of France. It is a story of a lost faith, of a brutal crusade that pitted Christian against Christian, and of a legendary last stand at a remote mountain fortress. And it is a story that is haunted, to this day, by the whisper of a lost, sacred treasure. So, find your comfortable place. Let the clamor of our modern world fall away. Close your eyes, and allow my voice to be your guide as we explore the world of the Cathars, their beautiful and challenging beliefs, their tragic demise, and the enduring mystery they left behind. Our story begins not with a pope or a king, but with a simple, profound, and deeply heretical idea. To understand the story of the Cathars, we must first understand the world they chose to reject. The 12th century Roman Catholic Church was at the zenith of its temporal power. It was an institution of immense wealth, deeply and inextricably involved in the feudal politics of Europe. It was led by a powerful and often militant papacy that could command armies, excommunicate kings, and crown emperors. Its cathedrals, like the great new Gothic structures rising in the north of France, were soaring, glorious monuments of stone, gold, and stained glass. Its rituals were elaborate. Its hierarchy of priests, bishops, and cardinals held immense power over the daily lives and the eternal souls of ordinary people. But in the sun-drenched, culturally sophisticated, and fiercely independent region of southern France known as the Languedoc, a different kind of spiritual hunger was growing. Here, in a land of powerful, independent counts, of vibrant cities, and of the refined romantic poetry of the troubadours, a very old set of beliefs began to take root and flourish. This was the faith that would come to be known as Catharism. The origins of Catharism are murky, a subject of much scholarly debate. It was not a faith born in the Languedoc, but one that flowed into it, likely from the east. Most historians trace its immediate predecessor to the Bogomils, a dualist Christian sect that arose in the 10th century in Bulgaria and spread throughout the Byzantine Empire. The Bogomils themselves were likely the inheritors of an even older tradition, a stream of dualist thought that can be traced back through groups like the Paulicians in Armenia, and even further back to the ancient Persian religion of Manichaeism and the various Gnostic movements of early Christianity. It was an ancient, underground river of thought that believed the world was not the creation of a single, benevolent God, but the battleground of two opposing forces. At the very heart of the Cathar faith was this radical, uncompromising dualism. They believed that the universe was the product of two eternal, and eternally opposed principles or gods. There was the good God. This was the God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus Christ. He was pure spirit, pure love, and pure, uncreated light. He was the creator of the spiritual world, the invisible realm of souls, of heaven, and of all things eternal and good. And then there was the evil God. This was a lesser, malevolent, and arrogant deity, whom the Cathars often identified with Satan, or with the biblical name Rex Mundi, the king of this world. This evil God, they taught, was the creator of the entire material world, the earth, the sky, the plants, the animals, and, most tragically, the human body. The material world, with its cycles of birth, sickness, decay, and death, was not a divine creation to be celebrated. It was a corrupt, evil, and temporary prison, a trap designed by the evil God to ensnare the divine sparks of light that had fallen from the good God's kingdom. This belief led to a worldview that was the complete and total inverse of Orthodox Catholicism. The God of the Old Testament, the wrathful, jealous, and often violent Yahweh who, in the book of Genesis, creates the physical world and declares it good, was, to the Cathars, not the true God at all. He was the evil demiurge, the Rex Mundi, and by extension, the Roman Catholic Church with its immense wealth, its vast landholdings, its deep involvement in worldly politics, and its worship of physical objects like the cross, an instrument of torture and death, and the material body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, was not the true Church of God. It was the church of the evil God, the Church of Satan, a corrupt institution designed to keep souls trapped in the material world. The human soul, the Cathars believed, was a divine angel, a pure spark of light that had, in a primordial war in heaven, been tricked or defeated by the evil god and had fallen from the world of light. It was then imprisoned in the tunic of flesh, the human body. Life on earth was not a gift from a loving creator. It was a state of exile, a period of punishment and suffering. And the ultimate goal of the human experience was to achieve liberation, to free the divine soul from the tomb of the body and from the endless, sorrowful cycle of reincarnation, or metempsychosis, which they, like the ancient Orphics, believed in. For the Cathars, Jesus Christ was the central figure of their faith, but he was not the Jesus of the Catholic Church. He was not the son of the evil creator God of the Old Testament. He was a pure spirit, a divine messenger, an emissary sent from the good God into the darkness of the material world to show humanity the path back to the world of light. But because he was a pure, divine being, he could not have had a real, physical, corruptible body. Like the ancient Gnostics, the Cathars were Docetists. They believed that Jesus only seemed to be human, that his body was a phantom or an illusion, and that he therefore did not truly suffer and die on the cross. His purpose was not to redeem humanity from original sin through a blood sacrificia concept they found barbaric. His purpose was to be a teacher, to deliver the secret gnosis, the saving knowledge, that would awaken the divine spark within each person and show them the way to escape the prison of matter. The Cathar community was divided into two distinct and clearly defined groups. The vast majority were the credentes or believers. These were the ordinary followers of the faith. They were not required to live the full, extremely difficult, ascetic life of the inner circle. They could be married, they could have children, they could own property, and they could live in the world. Their duty was to believe the teachings, to honor and support the spiritual elite, and to hope that, at the end of their lives, they too would be worthy of receiving the faith's one and only sacrament. The true heart of the Cathar faith, the spiritual core of the movement, lay with the inner circle, the perfecti, or the perfects. These were the men and women who had received the consolamentum. This was a ritual of spiritual baptism, performed not with water, but with the laying on of hands and the placing of the Gospel of John on the initiate's head. It was believed to be a direct transmission of the Holy Spirit, the same sacrament that the apostles had received from Christ. It was believed to cleanse the soul of all sin, to sever its ties to the material world, and to reconnect it with the world of light. Once an individual had received the consolamentum, they became a perfect. The life of a perfect was one of extreme, almost superhuman, asceticism and purity. They were strict vegetarians and in fact were closer to modern vegans. They abstained from all meat, eggs, and dairy products, as these were all products of sexual generation, an act they saw as part of the evil god's trap to imprison more divine souls in material bodies. The only flesh they were permitted to eat was fish, which they believed, due to an ancient misconception, did not reproduce sexually. They were completely celibate. They practiced long and arduous fasts. They lived a simple, itinerant life, traveling in pairs, dressed in simple black or dark blue robes, preaching to the believers and ministering to the sick and the poor. They were renowned for their humility, their honesty, and their gentle, peaceful demeanor. Unlike the rigidly patriarchal Catholic Church, the Cathars made no distinction between men and women in their spiritual hierarchy. A woman could become a perfect, she could preach, and she could administer the consolamentum, an idea that was radically egalitarian in the medieval world. The Cathars rejected the entire structure and all the sacraments of the Catholic Church. They had no ornate churches, only simple meeting houses. They rejected infant baptism with water, as an infant could not have faith. They rejected the Eucharist, believing the bread and wine could not possibly become the physical body and blood of a God who had no physical body. They rejected the veneration of saints and relics as idolatry. And they absolutely rejected the taking of oaths, which they believed bound the soul to the material world of the evil king of this world. This faith, with its emphasis on simplicity, on purity, and on a direct, personal experience of the divine, proved to be enormously popular in the Languedoc. It was embraced not just by the peasantry, but by the powerful local nobility. The Counts of Toulouse, the Viscounts of Carcassonne and Bezirceau valued the region's long tradition of political independence and were deeply resentful of the growing power of both the French king in the north and the Pope in Rome. The troubadours, the famous poets of courtly love, often moved in circles that were deeply sympathetic to the Cathars. For a time, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the Languedoc was a land of remarkable religious tolerance, a place where Catholics, Cathars, and a significant Jewish population coexisted in relative peace. But to the Church of Rome, and to its powerful and authoritarian leader, Pope Innocent III, this was an intolerable situation. This was not tolerance. It was a festering heresy, a spiritual cancer growing in the very heart of Christendom, and it had to be cut out with fire and with sword. For decades, the Roman Catholic Church had attempted to combat the spread of Catharism in the Languedoc through peaceful, if insistent, means. They sent preachers and legates to debate the heretics in public forums. The most famous of these was the Spanish priest, Saint Dominic, the future founder of the Dominican order. He and his followers traveled through the region barefoot, living a life of apostolic poverty, hoping to win back the hearts and minds of the people by demonstrating a purer form of Christianity than that of the often wealthy and corrupt local clergy. But they made little headway. The Cathar perfects, with their serene, ascetic lifestyle and their deep knowledge of Scripture, were formidable opponents in debate, and the local population, along with the powerful nobility, remained deeply protective of the good Christians in their midst. The culture of the Languedoc was one of tolerance and independence, and they were resentful of the Church's attempts to impose its authority. The patience of the papacy was wearing thin, and the man who sat on the papal throne, Pope Innocent III, was not a patient man. Elected in 1198, Innocent III was one of the most powerful, brilliant, and authoritarian popes in history. He believed absolutely in the supremacy of papal power over all secular rulers, and he viewed the flourishing Cathar heresy as a direct and intolerable challenge to the unity of Christendom. In 1208, an event occurred that would provide the Pope with the pretext he needed to unleash the full force of a holy war. He had sent a papal legate, a Cistercian monk named Pierre de Castelnau, to the Languedoc with the mission to demand that the region's most powerful lord, Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, take decisive action to excommunicate and suppress the heretics in his lands. The meeting was a disaster. Count Raymond, a cultured and tolerant man who was sympathetic to his Cathar subjects, refused to comply with the legate's harsh demands. After a heated argument, Pierre de Castelnau excommunicated the count. The next morning, on January 14, 1208, as the papal legate was preparing to cross the Rhone River to leave the region, he was assassinated, struck down by a lance thrown by one of Count Raymond's knights. The news of the murder of his personal representative sent Pope Innocent III into a rage. He saw the assassination as a declaration of war, the final, unforgivable act of a heretical and rebellious land. In March of 1208, he issued a papal bull calling for a crusade. But this was a new and terrifying kind of crusade. It was not a war against Muslims in the distant Holy Land. It was a war against fellow Christians, in the heart of Christian Europe. This was the Albigensian Crusade, named after the town of Albi, a major Cathar center. The Pope offered the land-hungry, ambitious nobles of northern France a powerful and irresistible incentive, the legally sanctioned right to seize the lands and titles of the heretical lords of the Languedoc. And, just as with a crusade to the Holy Land, he offered a full remission of sins for all who participated. It was an invitation to piety, plunder, and power. In the summer of 1209, a massive army of crusading knights, perhaps as many as 10,000 strong, gathered in Lyon. They were led by powerful figures like the Duke of Burgundy and, most importantly, by the ruthless and fanatically devout northern French nobleman, Simon de Montfort. They marched south into the heart of the Languedoc. What followed was 20 years of horrific, almost unimaginable brutality. The crusade quickly devolved from a religious war into a naked, opportunistic war of conquest. The northern French lords, using the holy pretext of heresy, sought to systematically destroy the political independence and the unique, tolerant culture of the south. The first major city to fall was Béziers, in July of 1209. The city was a known center of Catharism, but also had a large Catholic population. When the city was stormed by the Crusaders, the commander, according to a contemporary account, asked the papal legate, the abbot Arnaud Amaury, how they should distinguish the Catholics from the Cathars among the population. The abbot's alleged, chilling reply has echoed through the darkest corridors of history. Cadite eos.
Novi enim dominus qui sunt eius.
Kill them all, for the Lord knows those who are his. The city was put to the sword. The Crusaders rampaged through the streets, slaughtering thousands of men, women, and children, Catholic and Cathar alike, many of whom had sought refuge in the city's churches. The sack of Béziers was a calculated act of terror, designed to send a message to the rest of the Languedoc. Resistance is futile. One by one, the great cities and castles of the region fell. Carcassonne, with its magnificent fortified walls, surrendered. The war was marked by brutal sieges, by scorched earth tactics, and by mass executions of Cathars who refused to recant their faith. At the castle of Minerve, 140 Cathar perfects who refused to convert were burned alive in a massive pyre. At Lavore, the lady of the castle was thrown down a well and stoned to death, and her brother was hanged, along with 80 of his knights. 400 more perfects were burned. Simon de Montfort proved to be a brilliant and merciless military commander. He conquered vast territories and was eventually granted the titles of the defeated southern lords. The culture of the troubadours was extinguished. The power of the great houses of Toulouse and Trencavel was broken. The Languedoc was being remade, brought firmly under the control of the French crown and the Roman Church. By 1229, The official military phase of the Crusade was over, formalized by the Treaty of Paris. The southern lords were stripped of their power, and the region was effectively annexed by France. But the persecution of the Cathars was not over. In fact, it was about to become more systematic, more insidious, and more efficient. To root out the last vestiges of heresy, the papacy established a new, terrifyingly effective institution, the Papal Inquisition. Dominican and Franciscan friars, trained as expert theologians and interrogators, were sent into the Languedoc. They set up tribunals in cities and towns, and they began a systematic process of investigation. The methods of the Inquisition were a masterpiece of psychological pressure. The inquisitors would arrive in a village and deliver a sermon, calling for all heretics to confess within a time of grace. Those who confessed early were often given lighter penances. Then the real work began. The inquisitors would call in villagers one by one, questioning them under oath, asking them about their neighbors, their families, their friends. They built a vast network of informants. They used secret testimony, where the accused was not allowed to know the names of their accusers. Those who were accused of heresy were subjected to relentless interrogation. While physical torture was used, it was often the psychological pressure, the isolation, the fear, the endless questioning, the promise of mercy in exchange for a confession that broke people. The goal was not just to punish, but to get a confession, and, most importantly, to get the names of other heretics. Those who were found guilty and repented were given various penances. They might be forced to undertake a long pilgrimage, or to be publicly flogged. Many were forced to wear a large, yellow cross sewn onto their clothing for the rest of their lives, a public mark of their shame that made them social outcasts. Those who refused to repent, or who were found to have relapsed into heresy after a previous confession, were relaxed to the secular arm, a euphemism for being handed over to the local authorities to be burned at the stake. Under the relentless pressure of the Inquisition, the Cathar faith was driven deep underground. The prefecti, the spiritual leaders who were the heart of the religion, were hunted without mercy. For the next 2 decades, they survived as fugitives, hiding in forests, in remote mountain caves, and in the secret protection of a few remaining loyalist nobles. Their last and most legendary bastion of resistance, their final sanctuary, was a remote and seemingly impregnable mountain fortress, a place that would become the enduring symbol of Cathar defiance and martyrdom. Montségur. Perched atop a sheer, rocky peak or pog, at an altitude of over 1,200 meters, Montségur was more than a castle. It was a sanctuary. In the 1230s and 40s, it became the last refuge for a community of several hundred Cathar perfects and believers, the effective capital of a dying faith. In the spring of 1243, a royal French army arrived at the foot of the mountain and laid siege to the fortress. For nearly a year, the defenders of Montségur, a small garrison of about 100 soldiers protecting over 400 civilians, held out against an army of thousands. They endured a bitter mountain winter, starvation, and constant bombardment from the Crusaders' siege engines. But in March of 1244, their position finally became untenable. The Crusaders had managed, with incredible difficulty, to haul a trebuchet up to a position where it could bombard the fortress's main defenses. The defenders were forced to negotiate a surrender. They were given a truce of 2 weeks. During this time, any of the defenders who wished to renounce their Cathar faith and submit to the mercy of the Inquisition were told they would be allowed to leave freely. Not a single one did. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Many of the remaining believers and soldiers inside the fortress chose to use those 2 weeks to receive the consolamentum, the one sacrament that they knew would condemn them to death in the eyes of their conquerors. They chose to become perfects, to face the end with their souls purified and their faith intact. On the morning of March 16, 1244, more than 200 Cathar perfects, men and women, marched calmly down from the fortress gates. They did not ask for mercy. They walked, it is said, singing, into a massive pyre that had been constructed by the Crusaders in a field at the foot of the mountain. They were all burned alive. The fall of Montségur marked the effective end of Catharism as an organized religion. The last known Cathar perfect, Guillaume Balaibast, was captured and burned at the stake in 1321. The faith of the good Christians had been utterly and completely extinguished by fire and by sword. But a mystery, a legend, survived that final fiery siege. A legend that would whisper through the centuries. The story of the Cathars is, in the annals of history, a story of a faith that was brutally and systematically destroyed. The fire at the base of Montségur on that cold March morning in 1244 was meant to be the end. The final, horrifying punctuation mark on a 20-year crusade and a subsequent, century-long inquisition. It was meant to erase the good Christians and their radical beliefs from the memory of the world. But even in its final, tragic moments, a mystery was born. a legend that has survived the flames and has captivated the imagination of seekers and historians to this day. It is the legend of the lost Cathar treasure. According to the historical accounts of the siege of Montségur, and later the testimony given at Inquisition trials, on the night before the final surrender of the fortress, a daring escape took place. While their brethren prepared for martyrdom, for Cathar perfects were secretly lowered down the sheer, treacherous western cliff face of the mountain with ropes. They were not fleeing to save their own lives. They were on a sacred mission. They carried with them, it is said, the treasure of the Cathar church. They disappeared into the surrounding forests, aided by local sympathizers, and were never seen again. But what was this treasure? A treasure so important that 4 of the faith's most elite members would risk a perilous nighttime escape, leaving their friends and family to face the fire, in order to save it? The most mundane, and perhaps most likely, theory is that the treasure was a collection of money and precious objects that the Cathar community had amassed at Montségur, which had become a repository for the wealth of fugitive believers. The 4 escapees were simply trying to get these funds to safety, to help the few surviving Cathars continue their underground resistance in Lombardy, in northern Italy. But this explanation has never satisfied the romantic and the esoteric imagination. The Cathars, and particularly the perfects, were ascetics. They had renounced all worldly wealth and possessions. It seems unlikely that their most precious treasure would be one of gold or silver. It is far more likely that the treasure they would have risked everything to save was not material but spiritual. Many historians and researchers believe that the treasure was, in fact, a collection of their most sacred texts, their secret gospels, their theological treatises detailing their complex dualist cosmology, and their ritual books which contained the rites for the all-important consolamentum. In a world where the Inquisition was systematically burning every heretical book it could find, preserving this written wisdom, the very heart of their faith, would have been a mission of supreme importance. They were trying to save not their wealth, but their soul. But there are other, more romantic and deeply esoteric theories that connect the Cathars to the great, enduring mysteries of the Middle Ages. One of the most powerful of these theories is that the Cathars were the secret guardians of the Holy Grail. In this version of the legend, the Grail was not the cup of Christ, but perhaps a sacred object, a stone from heaven as described by the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, or, most intriguingly, a secret gospel, a book of love, that contained the true teachings of Jesus, a version that was Gnostic in nature and stood in direct opposition to the doctrines of Rome. In this view, Montségur was the Grail castle, Montsalvesh, the mountain of salvation, and the treasure that was smuggled out by the 4 perfects on that fateful night was the Grail itself. This theory has been fueled by the strange, mystical atmosphere of the Languedoc, and by the known connections between the troubadour poets, who often wrote of the Grail, and the Cathar sympathetic nobility. And, of course, in the grand, unified conspiracy theories of the 20th century, which we have explored in a previous journey, the story of the Cathars has been inextricably woven into the myth of the Priory of Chaon and the Knights Templar. In this narrative, the Cathars were allies, or perhaps even members, of the secret brotherhood that was guarding the sacred bloodline of Christ and Mary Magdalene. The treasure of Montségur, therefore, was not a book or a cup, but a person, perhaps a child of the Merovingian bloodline, a living Grail, who was smuggled to safety to continue the holy lineage in secret. These are powerful, compelling, and deeply romantic legends. But, like so many such stories, they are not supported by any direct historical evidence. They are a testament not to what the Cathars were, but to what they have come to represent in the modern imagination. A pure, lost, and secret wisdom, brutally suppressed by a corrupt and powerful orthodoxy. The true legacy of the Cathars is not a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered in a mountain cave. Their true legacy is their story. A powerful and tragic story of a community that dared to imagine a different kind of God, a different kind of church, and a different, more ascetic and puritanical way of living. They were a testament to the enduring power of dualist thought in the West, the ancient Gnostic idea that the world we live in is a flawed and fallen place, and that our true home is in a realm of pure spirit and light. They represent one of the most significant and popular heretical movements in the history of Christianity. And their brutal suppression by the Albigensian Crusade and the subsequent Papal Inquisition was a pivotal and bloody moment in the history of the Catholic Church. It was a moment when the Church consolidated its power, when it perfected the mechanisms of Inquisition and religious persecution, and when it demonstrated its willingness to use overwhelming, merciless force to crush any and all dissent. The ruins of their castles, like the magnificent, lonely fortress of Montségur, still stand today, silent sentinels on the hilltops of the Languedoc. They are hauntingly beautiful places, filled with the profound echo of a lost faith. They remind us of a time when the search for purity led a group of people to a belief that the world itself was a prison, and that the only true freedom was to be found in the liberation of the soul from the confines of the flesh, even if that liberation had to come through the purifying terror of the flames. The Cathars were a light that, for a time, burned brightly and with a strange, otherworldly purity in the south of France. And though that light was brutally and systematically extinguished, the questions they asked, the radical answers they proposed, and the story of their tragic and defiant fate continue to haunt the landscape of European history. And so our journey into the world of the Cathars, the pure ones of southern France, comes to its conclusion. We have drifted through the vibrant, tolerant culture of the medieval Languedoc, and we have witnessed its brutal and systematic destruction. We began our story with the good Christians, exploring the unique and radical beliefs of the Cathar faith. We learned of their profound dualism, their belief in a good God of spirit and an evil God of matter. We saw how they rejected the Old Testament, the Catholic Church, and the material world itself as the work of a lesser, malevolent creator, the Rex Mundi. We understood their vision of the human soul as a divine spark, a trapped angel, imprisoned in the tunic of flesh, and their belief in reincarnation as a sorrowful cycle of suffering. We met their two classes of followers, the ordinary credentes, believers, and the ascetic, celibate, and vegetarian inner circle of the perfecti, who, through the sacrament of the consolamentum, had dedicated their lives to a path of absolute purity. Then, our journey took a dark and violent turn as we explored the Albigensian Crusade. We saw how the assassination of the papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau, in 1208, gave the powerful Pope Innocent III the pretext he needed to unleash a holy war against fellow Christians. We followed the crusading armies of northern France, led by ruthless commanders like Simon de Montfort, as they marched south. We witnessed the horrific massacre at Béziers, where thousands were slain without distinction, under the infamous command, "Kill them all, for the Lord knows those who are his." And we saw how this crusade devolved into a war of conquest, which crushed the political independence of the Languedoc and brought it under the control of the French crown. We followed the aftermath of the war, the establishment of the terrifyingly efficient papal inquisition, which hunted down the last vestiges of the heresy with a systematic combination of surveillance, interrogation, and psychological pressure, forcing the Cathar faith deep underground. And finally, we stood at the foot of their last, legendary mountain sanctuary, the fortress of Montségur. We witnessed the year-long siege, and the final, defiant act of the besieged. We learned of the legend of the lost Cathar treasure, smuggled out of the fortress by four perfects on the eve of surrender. And we stood, in our imagination, by the great pyre at the foot of the mountain on March 16, 1244, watching as more than 200 Cathar perfects walked, singing, into the flames, choosing a martyr's death over a life of renunciation. The story of the Cathars is a profound and somber one. It is a powerful, cautionary tale about the dangers of religious intolerance and the brutal mechanisms of power when it feels threatened. It is a story of how a culture of poetry, of tolerance, of independent thought can be utterly and completely extinguished by a crusade fueled by a combination of religious fanaticism and political greed. But it is also a story of unwavering faith, of a community that, in the face of annihilation, chose martyrdom over the renunciation of their core beliefs. Their legendary treasure, if it ever existed in a physical form, was never found. But perhaps their true legacy is not a hidden object, a secret gospel, or a lost chalice. Perhaps their true legacy is the question they pose, the echo that still whispers from the ruins of their mountain castles. An echo that asks about the nature of good and evil, the meaning of purity, and the eternal and often tragic, human search for a path back to a lost world of light. The Cathars were a light that, for a time, burned with a strange and otherworldly purity in the south of France. And though that light was brutally extinguished, the story of their faith, and their tragic fate, continues to haunt the landscape of European history. Thank you for joining me on this voyage with Driftwood Histories. If these stories have stirred your curiosity and soothed your mind, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of fellow travelers. There are many more hidden currents of time, many more secret histories, for us to explore together. Until then, sleep well. May your own search for the truth be a peaceful one, and may your dreams be filled with a clear and gentle light. Good night.